Hi, everyone. We are Ruben and Barbara Marberry, coming from Chicago, and we are grateful to share some thoughts with all of you that can help all of us continue to build on the foundations of love and respect that we have in our marriage and families. And so we're going to jump right in. You can follow along by turning to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33. And that says, "However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband." This is likely a very familiar passage to us, and perhaps the first passage that comes to mind when the subject of love and respect comes up. And as you might expect, the impact of the pandemic on human relationships during quarantine is ongoing and quite significant. And so we want you to understand, and it's something that we have to remember, that the pandemic creates a vulnerability that's deeply felt in a lot of marriages and families because of several reasons. And here are a couple of those reasons.
One is just a radical change in our patterns, which I'm not telling you something you don't already know. But life in quarantine has disrupted the patterns of most, if not all, families in some significant way. And as humans, the truth is we look for patterns, we look for consistencies, and we want to establish a pattern because it helps us just to make sense of our experiences, and it provides a baseline for what each of us considers normal in our lives. And as married couples and as parents, some of us may be parents as well, we create these patterns in close collaboration with one another. One example is just uh, greetings as well as farewells. When you're headed off to work, which now might be just going into the living room, um, but greetings and farewells. And if those interactions don't quite feel normal, or the way they would usually, don't walk away from the feeling the same, we just feel off. We feel like something just isn't right. And we do so much in patterns as people. That's just how people work. We do things in patterns. We even have arguments in patterns. If you stopped and thought about it, you probably noticed that many of your arguments are about kind of the same things, and we tend to argue the same way, even. Um, we have conflicts over the same issues, way we respond to each other, things like working, exercising, eating, downtime, spending time with friends. All of those things have been affected by our time in quarantine. And as a result, a lot of us are having to deal with challenges because of the changes. It's unsettling for us. I'll give you just a couple of examples. For instance, eating. There is a brother here the other day who said, yeah, ever since COVID-19, there's been a lot of eating going on in our house. And our eating habits quite often change in response to our emotions, in response to situations. And those unhealthy eating patterns during a crisis, of course, as we know, are not serving us, especially if we've had struggles with poor eating habits in the past. Another is our sleeping patterns. And for many of us, our sleeping patterns have been affected. Just the daily activity cycle creates that circadian rhythm, and work, exercise, eating, light exposure, so many different things affect our sleeping patterns. And that's really foundational for health. And so those are just two examples, but a broad disruption in patterns will also then affect our communication with one another, our interaction with each other, our intimacy. And so it impacts how we love and respect one another.
In addition to that, we have greater and more prolonged levels of stress. That's happening to so many of us. We are in closer quarters with each other and for longer than many of us have been used to. I ran across this quote not that long ago, an anonymous quote that said, "I liked my spouse until I had to be around them all day long." And so hopefully that doesn't apply to any of you, but certainly that expresses a sentiment that a number of people are feeling because now they are, with their patterns disrupted, thrown into close quarters with each other for much longer periods of time. And so many couples, and if you're like this, you understand because many couples have seen their jobs impacted by significant changes. Whether that's a greater expectation of productivity and increased working hours, or a change in how work is done, or maybe there's been a decrease in pay or a decrease in the overall support you're getting, but an expectation that even more work would be done. Many of us have family members and friends that we're concerned about because we don't want them to get COVID-19, or we know someone who's been affected by it. If you've got underlying health issues and challenges, you might be under a constant state of stress and anxiety because of your concern about getting COVID. The great thing is that love and respect are two anchors. They can stabilize and strengthen couples and families during this very unstable time by providing concepts and direction that we can create deliberate patterns around. The cool thing is, love and respect work well by being incorporated into patterns and interactions. You can actually see that as you read through the language in Ephesians chapter 5. For example, verse 21 says, submit to one another. This really works best. Submission works best as a pattern of mutual activity, or what happens is one party or the other, the husband or the wife, gets frustrated because they feel like they're the only one who is submitting. And so, mutual submission is a phenomenal pattern to practice in your marriage. COVID-19 has created new areas in which we can daily submit to one another. We have to submit to each other's need for space in close quarters, as well as submitting to the time that each of us need to process daily stressors. There are new schedules, new protocols. I find that one of these others, husband or the wife, tends to feel stronger about the need for decontamination and the willingness to wear a mask, right? All of us need to consider, with these new things in place, how we will submit to one another. One passage that can help is Isaiah chapter 40, verse 11. And that says, he tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young. The shepherd could drive the flock at a certain pace, but what he does is he submits to the needs of the flock. He personally carries the lambs and only lets the flock travel at the pace of those who have young, the pace that they can handle, that they can maintain. One of the things to remember is Jesus displayed incredible heart and love on the cross, but that love was really shown day to day. It was shown in the daily effort that Jesus made over his entire lifetime.
And some of the things I think about that we're talking about right now are things that you might think, yeah, I know my life has been disrupted. I know things are different now. We've been in this situation for long enough that we're aware of it. But when you think about how Jesus was so consistent, it provided peace. And, I think about Mr. Rogers. I love Mr. Rogers. I love Mr. Rogers so much. And Mr. Rogers did the same thing all the time. And kids all over love Mr. Rogers because he was just so dependable. You knew what he was going to do. And sometimes we don't think about it, but when we're consistent, we provide love to our spouse. Being consistent is incredibly loving, and it's even respectful. And Jesus displayed great faithfulness, integrity, care, concern to God and to those around him, even before he started his ministry. We see it in his prayer life in Hebrews 5, verse 7. It says that Jesus consistently had a pattern of loud cries and tears to God and continual reverent submission. He had created a pattern in his life. That consistency paid off in many ways for him and for others. And also in Luke chapter 5, verse 16, we see it in his self care. The passage tells us that Jesus often retreated to lonely places, and that was a way for him to have appropriate time away so that he could process all that he was going through. And we see it in forgiveness. Jesus consistently was forgiving, even to the point when he was on the cross and he was in the middle of being crucified, that he had already forgiven. In John 6:64, it tells us about that. He knew who was going to betray him. He knew what was going to happen. But because of his consistency, he continued to forgive. And all of that was done out of love and respect for God. And I think about, I don't think we often consider that as I am consistent, it provides a stability in my home and provides a stability in my relationship with my spouse. And that's one way of loving my spouse. And that's a way of respecting my spouse and not taking them off guard all the time.
Love and respect, they function great in patterns. And so what we can do, one of the best things we can do is be deliberate about creating new patterns of connection and behavior that demonstrates our love and respect for one another in this time, in this time of the pandemic. Before COVID-19, we may not have had to have been as clear, right? Especially if we've been married for a long time. These patterns that we've developed, they allowed us to have a bit of contextual shorthand. Barbara and I, we've been married almost 30 years. And so we have stories and encounters in our lifetime where we have shrunk them down to one word or just a few words. And so when we are trying to describe something, we'll retrieve that memory just with one word, and we'll point at something and say, oh, it's like this. And it reminds me of that. And so even if others are listening to us, they may not understand the reference, but because we have this verbal shorthand, we're able to speak in a language that belongs just to us. And that's powerful when we are trying to communicate love and respect for each other. And so we want to end with some very practical thoughts on love and respect and how we can have that and establish those, the things that we can do for ourselves as couples and also in our families. And so we're going to give you 5 ideas for love and 5 ideas for respect. And so we'll start with the ideas for love. The first idea is to simplify your date times. I think this is really, really great, right? Because right now it can feel so challenging to put things together to make a great date, right? It's difficult, if not impossible, to find a sitter. Going out is very challenging and also awkward, and we're already constantly with each other in close quarters. And so since we're in those close quarters, it's important to designate a specific time for our date time. It could be as simple as, okay, I know we were all doing the dishes a few minutes ago, but now it's daytime. And it's important to identify special things that are simple, that bring each of you joy, and spend time doing that for the other person. You can modify this when you are trying to spend time with your children as well. Simplifying the time together and focusing on quality and consistency are the most important thing.
So a second thing, as far as building love in our marriage, is creating new language. So, when we have a shared language, and I'm not talking about English, but when we have certain terms, ways of communicating, it maintains intimacy and connection. And many of us already have that kind of verbal shorthand that we was talking about earlier, where we use certain terms or metaphors to describe things that only we or our family could understand. Even as I say that, I think about there's this one story when our daughters were small, but I've hearkened back to it many a time just by saying creamy. And just by saying that one word, ah, yes, there's a long story behind that. But just by saying that one word, Ruben knows where I'm at emotionally. He knows what probably just happened, why I would say that. Um, but things like that are so helpful. And, if we can lean into the challenges of the pandemic and create terms that will allow our spouse to chuckle or for our kids to, if it brings a smile to their face, something along those lines. And, you can even just think up terms, but if you can try to approach some, certainly not all, but if you can try to approach some of the challenges of this time, for those of us who have kids who are school age, I'm sure there's enough to choose from there. But if we can find something to make a joke out of, to be lighthearted about it, and we choose a word that kind of sums it up, it kind of helps us get through the day.
The next thing is I want us to be deliberate about touch. This is really important, right? We've lost so much physical connection because of the quarantine. And I wonder, even at the other side of all this, if we'll really ever feel comfortable about some greetings again, shaking hands and things like that. And so physical touch, just have to remember that physical touch has so much in the way of healing properties. I love the way Jesus often opted for touching people when he healed them. Even though he could have and sometimes did just say a word, he would most of the time opt to touch people, lepers, and he would hold the little children. I believe he was trying to transfer something that's powerful through touch. Back scratches, neck rubs, holding hands, long hugs, sitting very close to one another. All of those things and more can communicate love in a way that words might not be able to do as effectively. And so we can translate those kinds of things, the hugs and the holding hands and things like that, where it's appropriate to our kids as well. Some kids would really appreciate a special handshake or a well thought out rough and tumble playtime, right? And so being able to think about what our children need as well as think about what our spouse needs in regard to touch is very important.
And before moving on to the next point, one thing with that is just giving your spouse, giving your kids hugs out of the blue for no particular reason, and make it a long hug. There's so much, especially if you have kids, there's so much that is different or that is up in the air. We don't know when are they going to be back in school physically. There's so many different things. Are their friendships as close as they used to be? There's so many different things that are question marks. And just a hug doesn't even have to have words attached to it, but a hug can be so reassuring. And, there's nothing like a hug from your mom. There's nothing like a hug from your dad. Like they could get a hug maybe from someone else, but getting a hug from your mom or your dad, it just calms a child down so much. It's almost like saying without words, it's going to be okay. But the fourth thing in building love is be specific about what you love. And, one of the challenges in communication is that quite often when we share about something that we don't like, or we share about something that is bothering us, that we're unhappy about, we can be very specific and very clear about that. But then when it comes to sharing about, like, maybe if whatever the issue is has been resolved or someone changed in response to our sharing, then when we express happiness about things that are better, it doesn't quite match, like the degree of animation, and perhaps sometimes even the volume at which we expressed the unhappiness might be a little bit higher than when we express, hey, things are better, or oh, I really appreciated that. And we want to deliberately turn that around and make it the opposite. And to say, hey, you're awesome, you're great, is wonderful. And I appreciate you. But to say specifically why and how, um, hey, when you gave me that hug earlier, here's how it really helped me because this is what I was thinking about at the time. Or I really appreciate that you put your dishes in the sink. Just if we can keep, or put your dishes in the dishwasher, or better yet, if you wash that dish when you're done. Sorry. Okay. But if we share specifically what we appreciate and why, like, thank you so much for doing that because man, the more clutter in the kitchen or the more clutter in the dining room or whatever, it's just difficult for me to think straight. So when you did that, it really actually helped me out a lot. But when we're specific about it, the more specific, the better. It really has an impact. Sometimes we make a comment like that, and we're very animated about what we appreciate and we're very specific about it. That can last with a person the entire day. You can make someone's day and you don't even realize it. And it's really important for children because it teaches them language. And there are times when they appreciate something that you've done, or they appreciate something that one of their siblings has done, but they just don't have the language to express that. And so if you consistently are saying, here's specifically what I appreciate and why, and no, I really want you to know, I'm not trying to be nice here. I want you to know why that was really helpful, or why I really admired that, or why I respected what you did, or wow, I really see something special in you that shows a lot about your character or your love for God. When we share those things, then we're giving our kids uh, a phenomenal example so that they can express later themselves.
And the fifth and final practical application on building love in our marriages is share what you need concerning love. One of the things that I try to tell folks often, spouses, I tell them don't don't let your spouse's offering to you feel less just because you ask them to give you what you need. We don't want to make our spouses have to be mind readers,
Yeah.
right? Let's educate our spouses on what we feel loved, how we feel loved, and this will change. It changes naturally over time. Some of it does, but for many of us, it is greatly impacted by the pandemic. If the ways that you feel love have been hampered by COVID restrictions, for example, maybe you love to go out to eat and that's something that you used to do together, that one spouse would take the other out to a favorite restaurant and they've not been able to do so because of COVID restrictions, then find ways where you can to recreate versions of what you like in your home. If you can find a way to recreate that sort of cafe type feel, and again, for many of us, space is an issue, but you can take time to put props in place and create a little nook or take over the kitchen table, the dining room table, and create a cafe type feel. If you are someone that loves to go out, recreate that at home. In some ways, that will be even more special because your spouse will know how much you appreciate and you listen to what they needed, and you're trying to help them as best you can with the resources that you have.
And one thing adding on to that point is if we can identify what times of day or what points in our regular routine as a family are challenging for us, and think through that and think about what would really help me during those times, and then communicate that to our spouses, communicate that to our kids. Once again, it's a great example because then we can ask them. And so, what is a challenging time for you? Like, is it hard in the morning when we're kind of trying to get going on our day, and what makes that a difficult time, and what would help you? But to be able to express those things is huge because you're also teaching your kids to be self-reflective, and that they too don't need to be mind readers, and they don't need to expect that of others. and just teaching them how to speak up for themselves and identify, hey, I have this need, and not think, well, am I kind of crazy for thinking that or feeling that? But instead, no, you're not. I want you to tell me and to encourage that. So the next thing we're going to share is 5 ideas for respect. Those were 5 ideas for love, to build love. Simplify our date times. The second was create a new language. Third, be deliberate about touch. Fourth, be specific about what you love. And then fifth, share what you need concerning love. So now, 5 ideas for respect. The first one is, where possible, give honor to what your spouse feels is important. So give honor to that, especially if it doesn't make sense to you. And sometimes what makes sense to us, we think is the reason it makes sense to us is because it's just true. Or the reason it makes sense to us is because it's the better option. But in humility, we can decide, hey, you know what? If you prefer to have clothes folded this way, or you prefer to have your towels folded a certain way, if you prefer to, the toilet paper roll, either the toilet paper roll will come out over the top or to come underneath. My preferred way is over top. It just makes more sense to me. But anyway, but if you can just defer to what your spouse wants, what they think is important, that makes a huge difference in showing honor and respect for that person. And just say, hey, you know what? That's my preference, but let's do it the way you want because I respect you. And I want you to know that you, even in the small things, it makes a difference. And I want you to know that I'm hearing you and I want to do things that way.
The second practical application in this section is don't multitask when you're having important conversations. And one of the things that I'm realizing is that in this age of COVID-19, there are a lot more important conversations than I may be aware of, because when you're talking to your spouse or when you're talking to your children, sometimes there's not going to be a big blinking neon sign that says, all right, this is an important conversation. And so what we have to do is listen more carefully because, again, because the patterns have changed, we need to make sure that we pay more careful attention to what our spouses and our children are saying. And so, again, don't multitask when you're having important conversations. Being in close confines with each other is causing the lines between work and home to constantly be blurred for us, right? And so the temptation that I have heard and I've seen in my own life is to try to do a number of things at one time because that helps me to feel more efficient. And so giving your spouse or giving your child undivided attention can really communicate respect. And the converse is true. Giving them divided attention tends to communicate disrespect. Turning away from your spouse to do other tasks, or if we look our child in the eye, then they know we are paying very close attention to them, and instantly they can feel like they are the most important thing going on in our lives right at that moment. And so we can teach great listening skills to our children by modeling this out in our relationships. I found this to be true in our own family. I remember when our kids were younger, and I would sometimes have difficulty getting them to stop what they were doing and pay attention to me as I was speaking to them. That was very frustrating to me. But one of the things that I realized was that they were modeling my behavior when I would respond to Barbara. She would want to talk about something, and I would assure her that I was listening, even though I was turned away from her, working on the computer, trying to do a number of tasks. I saw that as I paid close attention to what she was saying, the children modeled my behavior, and that problem actually started going away. And so I just want to encourage us to practice great listening skills. summarize what we hear when our spouses or our children are saying things to us. Here's what I hear you are saying. Is that correct? Right? Ask clarifying questions. You know, this is what I think you mean. Is that right? Or would you say it's more like this? You know, maintain an open body posture. If you're talking to your spouse and your arms are folded and your body's kind of close and, you know, folded in on itself, then that's going to communicate, I may be listening, but I don't really like what you're saying. And so having that kind of great open body posture can help.
Funny, you use that example about um, not about listening. Stop what you're doing and listening, because as Ruben was talking, I was thinking of an example. Um, when our girls were growing up, Ruben plays video games and he's like really, really good at it, right? And so then, of course, the girls started playing the video games and they wanted to be as good as daddy. And mommy tried to play video games to relate, but mommy is really bad at it and she gets really tense and nervous when the bad people show up. So mommy doesn't play video games. But there was a point in time when Ruben would be playing video games and the girls would be sitting with him and watching, or maybe they'd be playing along or whatever. And if I came into the room and I said, "Hey, honey," maybe I just wanted to mention something or whatever, he would stop. He would pause the game, turn and look at me. Yes. And, you know, I was just wondering, do you know where I put my glasses? I can't find them. Whatever it was, something I can't find. Well, whatever it was, he would, you know, acknowledge that, respond, and I guess at some point he made the decision to start doing that. It feels like at some point that started happening. So anyway, he would acknowledge, respond, and then even sometimes say, "Is there anything else you needed?" And oh no, no, that's it, that's all. Okay, cool. And so then he would turn back, like his entire body would turn to me, and then he would turn back, start up the game again, and everything. But the girls saw that happen enough times that then when they were playing video games, if I came into the room and said, "Hey, ladies, I wanted to ask a question real quick," they would stop, pause the game, turn, and do the exact same thing. And he never said to them, "This is what you need to do." But by him modeling it, they were imitating, and it was a beautiful thing. All right, so the third point is to practice validation. Oh boy, this is a really good one, a big one. But when we validate what someone else is sharing, what they're saying, it doesn't mean that we agree. We don't have to agree and validate. So it means instead that we've considered what the person has said. It means that we see where they're coming from. We're able to step out of our shoes, put ourselves in their situation. We're able to take a look at things from their perspective. And that's huge. A lot of times, that's really the main thing that someone wants. Like, can you just understand what I'm saying to you? Can you just understand my feelings? If you could validate why I feel hurt or why I feel neglected or why I feel confused right now. Do you see what I'm saying about there were mixed signals, whatever it is? But when we ask questions like, "Well, what were you thinking?" Or if we ask, why on earth would you do something like that? That communicates a whole lot more, and you can hear that, I'm sure, right now. But that communicates you weren't thinking. It communicates your thought process was really flawed. And so we want to ask with sincerity, "Can you tell me more about that? I really want to understand where you're coming from, what you were feeling, what was happening in the moment." Um, and validation lowers the tension immediately in any conversation, and it helps create a bridge to resolve hurt feelings, to repair even times when there's this kind of confused or people are feeling like there's something between them. Validation makes a big difference. And, you know, phrases such as, you know, "I can see why you would think that. That makes sense." Or, "You know what, if I were in your shoes, that would make a lot of sense to me. Yep, I hear that. And I understand now why that came across that way. You know, I so did not mean it that way, but I do understand how it came across that way, and that would be hurtful, or that would be confusing, or that would make me feel blah, 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 whatever it is. But if we can validate each other's feelings, um, then that's the biggest step toward resolution.
The fourth thing is value feedback. You know, as couples, we can give each other a significant amount of feedback, whether we are asking for it directly or we're just receiving it out of the goodness of our spouse's hearts, right? And our spouses can feel really respected when we respond to their thoughts. And so here are a couple of ways that we can communicate respect with each other. First is we can listen all the way through. You know, a lot of times we interrupt, and I've seen this happen so many times as I talk to couples where one spouse will start sharing the story from their perspective, and the other spouse will interrupt them to make sure they get all the details right. You know, the spouse will start talking, and then the other spouse sort of jumps in thinking they're helpful when what's happening is they're actually communicating disrespect. You know, the other spouse feels like, okay, the thing you're interrupting me for is a minor thing. It's a detail that I may have gotten wrong, but it's not actually the reason why I'm sharing that story. And so they end up feeling less respected because they keep getting interrupted. Next, you can focus on what you can do, right? This is really important because even if you don't implement all of what your spouse is asking you to do, you can communicate that you were listening because you have decided to do something from what they have shared, right? When you put that into practice, even if it's only partially done, what that says is, I heard your input, I value your input, it means a lot to me, and I want to do what I can based on what I've heard. And then lastly, there, thank your spouse or your children, right? Try to hear that feedback as helpful, not nagging or whatever negative way we may look at it, right? When you thank the person sincerely, that resonates with them and communicates respect. So value feedback.
Mm-hmm. And then the last is love always protects. And we really need to be careful the way that we characterize our spouse and even our children in conversations with them and especially with other people. So if we speak in a disparaging way about them, about how they look, about how they talk, how they act, if we have a laugh at their expense, we set them up for feeling disrespected and unloved. And it's a feeling that can be tough to push past, depending on how public or significant the event was in which they were disrespected. And I think of an example that happened, gosh, probably like 20 years ago, probably more. But it just was made a big impact on my heart. And what happened was we were living in Richmond, Virginia at the time, and the house that we were renting, they had a driveway that was had a little bit of a curve to it, and there were several trees in the front and a couple that were near the driveway. And so I was leaving the house early morning to go to the gym, and so I guess it was dark. Anyway, I'm trying to set this up to just so it makes sense what I did, but I backed the car into a tree. And when I did, I bust one of the tail lights out of the back of the car. And so I think, we probably came out, took a look at it. You can still make it to the gym. So I went to the gym, came back home. But so now we have this tail light to take care of, right? And so anyway, later in the day, and so we were, completely planning on getting it fixed. But later that day, someone came over to our house, and it was a brother, and he was in the house talking to Ruben, and I was either somewhere else in the room or something like that, but he was speaking directly to Ruben, not to both of us. And he said, "Oh yeah, man, I saw your car. The taillight's out. What happened?" And Ruben said, "Yeah, we just backed into a tree. We're going to be getting it fixed the next day or so. I already called insurance about it." And I was so struck by that because it would have been easy for him, and he would have been telling the truth had he said, "Yeah, my wife backed the car into a tree." but he didn't. He said, yeah, we backed the car into a tree. And I felt so protected in that moment, and just appreciative, because I was embarrassed about having done that. Um, and there's all sorts of ways that we can, there are different things that our spouse will do, there are different things that our kids will do that will drive us crazy. And there's different things that they'll do that make us upset, or that end up costing money, and you have to call the insurance about it. But what I'm trying to communicate right now, is not that we need to cover up one another's sin, but we also don't need to embarrass. We don't need to make another person in our family feel bad. But instead, what we want to communicate is, I stand with you. That if it happened to you, it happened to me too. That if you did it, I did it too. It's always an us thing. It's not a, well, look what you did this time. It's always an us thing. And love always protects. And I think about all these different things. There's 5 things that we mentioned now about respect. 1, giving honor to your spouse. When possible, give honor to them. 2 was to don't multitask when having important conversations. 3, practice validation. 4, value feedback. And then 5, love always protects. If we really try to put these things into practice, it will make a huge difference. And this time when we're together and we're not able to go out as much, and especially heading into the winter here, we're not able to go out as much, what we will find is that this time will actually end up give us more opportunities to practice these things, and we'll have a stronger marriage at the end of it all. We'll have a stronger relationship with our kids as well.
Well, that's the end of our time, and we hope these thoughts have been helpful to you. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to being with all of you this coming weekend. God bless.